Hello, welcome to this year's Oktoberfest video. We're going to be talking about Robert Weine's movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and I'm joined by Dr. Todd McGowan. Todd, thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
So, Todd McGowan teaches theory and film at the University of Vermont. He's the author of Enjoyment, Right and Left, The Racist Fantasy, Emancipation After Hegel, Capitalism and Desire, Only a Joke Can Save Us, and other works. He's also the co-editor with Slavoj Žižek and Adrian Johnson of the Diuresis series at Northwestern University Press, as well as being the co-host of the Y Theory podcast with Ryan Engley. I will also say Todd is one of the professors who's had the most impact on me as a scholar and thinker. So let's jump right in and talk about Caligari.
Okay. So Caligari is a French, why did I say that? It's a German Expressionist film from 1920, as Phil said, and it's so it basically tells the story of this guy, Dr. Caligari, who's a intimidating figure, and it's told through the flashback narrative of this guy named Francis, who starts to recount the story to someone sitting next to him on a park bench. And then it turns out that we come back to the end of the film when the flashback ends, and it turns out that Francis is in a mental institution, and the person that he's described as Caligari is actually the head of the mental institution. So that's really important for how people think about the politics of this film. But during the story, so it's like a film noir, and in fact, it's very influential in film noir. It's like a film noir in the sense that you get, once the flashback narrative starts, you get caught up in that and lost in that. And at least I forget that this is a flashback, and you're into the story, and the story is about a town fair and a series of murders that take place at the town fair. And this guy comes to the fair who is Caligari, who ends up being the head of the mental institution, and he has a somnambulist, a guy under his power, Cesare, and he rouses him, even though he's been supposedly sleeping for hundreds of years, and he rouses him, and then Cesare commits 2 murders, and then there's a third attempted murder, but it's not Cesare, it's some other guy who tries to do it under the cover of Cesare, thinking that he'll get the blame. And then this ultimately leads, this third murder attempt leads, and Francis has a girlfriend who gets under the control of Caligari, and also Francis's best friend, Alan, who also is in love with the girl's little plot complication, ends up being killed. So he's the second murder victim. The town clerk is the first murder victim. And then in this third murder attempt, we get they run back to the mental institution, where we see that the guy running the institution looks like Caligari, is Caligari, and so then the film ends with, we're back in the outside narrative, and it's this guy Francis who's in the asylum, and the guy who looks like Caligari is running it, and it's not clear, is this guy really Caligari, or is it just some paranoid delusion by Francis? So that's it.
Yeah. So I'd like us to start our discussion by talking a bit about German Expressionism, because this is
Sure.
debatably at least the best example of German Expressionist cinema. It's definitely up there in terms of its influence. So what for you are like the key things of German Expressionism?
Right. I think you're right that it's usually this film or Nosferatu are thought of as the 2 paradigmatic German Expressionist films. I think one of the main things, if you watch the film, it's very clear that the settings are not realistic. The settings are meant to create a sense of the distortion that subjectivity itself creates in our view of the world. And so the film, through this incredible crazy mise en scène, like with doorways that are slanted and the town in the background doesn't look like a town at all. It looks like a painting of a town, and not a realistic painting, but a very skewed painting. And so I think that to me, that's the main thing, is that the acting is not realistic. Everything in the mise en scène is distorted. And I think the point is to give us a sense of how subjectivity, just like an expressionist painting, how subjectivity distorts our perspective. I don't know. I think that's the real idea of the film, and German Expressionism as a movement.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was rewatching this, these sets are Kafka made visual, right? These sort of these like crazed distortions. But the other thing I was thinking is, it's got to be incredibly difficult to act on those sets, right? I was struck by, like, if we think about this from an actor's perspective, if you have a thin sort of walkway that goes down and like tilted at an angle,
right?
Like, you've got to be very careful to not fall off that. And like, there's that great scene in the latter portion of the film where Cesare kidnaps Jane, and he's like carrying her unconscious body off. And I don't even know what exactly it's supposed to be, but there's this sort of ramp that goes up and then turns, and it's a very thin ramp. Now, I was just thinking, as an actor, to carry someone, because he's carrying her under one arm.
Right. I mean, I think your point is that you can't act realistically under those circumstances. Yeah, and I think that's how all the elements of, like, the acting is linked to the setting, which is linked to the costume design, which is linked to the lighting, right? The lighting is it's almost all low key lighting. So it doesn't create real definitive shadows. And I think all those things are part of what make up the German Expressionist aesthetic, I think.
Yeah. The other thing I was wondering is, this is a silent film, right? And so, you mentioned the non-realistic acting. Is how much does the non-realistic acting of German Expressionism sort of differ from the non-realistic acting of other silent film genres?
Yeah,
it's
that's
never realistic. Like,
no, it's
you always
not.
have to be like,
right. Is there a difference between, say, the way Keaton acts and the way the actors act here? I'm not sure. It's a good point. I think that the other genres would have preferred to have a naturalistic acting, but they just couldn't, because that's the silent aesthetic doesn't allow for that. But it's a good point. I think it's maybe a little more exaggerated here, but not. I mean, the other thing is there's not as much movement in the image. It's much more like a series of photographs or a series of paintings, right? Like, there's not. You don't see. Okay, there's he's carrying her up the hillside or whatever that is. But basically, you don't see characters. A lot of, like, Caligari himself almost doesn't move in the image. He's just, lift up his head, but little bodily movement. So that's a little different. Like, in comedy, especially, it's silent comedy. It's all about the movement, and here there's not that much movement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, that the acting style of silent films in some ways lends themselves more to German Expressionism than to other types. And I think if we look at sort of later pieces that are really influenced by German Expressionism, like Tim Burton's films, for instance, they'll see that sort of, I'm thinking like the Batman, Tim Burton's Batman movies, like, nothing there is realistic and the way, or naturalistic in the way it is with like even the Christopher Nolan films.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's right.
Reality.
Like that the Burton Batman films are much more German Expressionist, and then the Nolan ones are much more naturalistic. I think that's true. I mean, your link to Kafka is really good. So Trial is it's unfinished, but it's roughly 1920, right? So it's almost exact contemporary of Caligari. So Weine and Kafka, they're doing. I think they're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. So why is that such a popular thing in the sort of larger German-speaking world at this time? Because I mean, Kafka is Czech, but he's a German-speaking.
He's a German speaker, yeah. And Freud is Austrian, but he's also a German speaker. I think that. I mean, part of it is the what's happening just society-wide and intellectually in Germany. And so in the German-speaking area, there's Freud, and then there's phenomenology, which is also developed by Edmund Husserl, who was German, and then following him, Heidegger. There's a sense of how our perspective, we only gain the world or apprehend the world through our perspective, and then that's a distorted perspective. So I think that there's this, seems like that's in the air. And also, of course, the idea, I mean, this is totally different, but the idea of the unconscious, I think it's hard to think about Kafka and hard to think about German Expressionism without thinking about unconscious and how it's not just that we perceive the world, but that we distort it through our own unconscious in ways that we're not aware of. So I think that's pretty important in how what Weine is trying to do in the film.
Yeah, I mean, so I think those are some of the key sort of philosophical and theoretical things going on. But the other element, of course, is that this is immediately after World War One, and Germany is defeated. And World War One was such a psychologically shattering experience for Europeans across the board, but for Germany especially, I think, because not only did they lose this war, they were also sort of entirely blamed for it in ways that are
right. But they didn't blame themselves. They didn't blame themselves.
No, but I think that sense of we've been made the sort of scapegoats for this war that wasn't in fact our fault. It was Serbia and Austria that kicks everything off, and yet Germany held responsible. And
that's an interesting point. But don't you think? How do you then explain something like film noir, which picks up totally the impulse of German Expressionism, but it's not tied to any world historical defeat that the U.S. suffered, right? Like it's I mean, maybe. I know that's what. I mean, your position. I mean, I'm more of the minority report here. Like I know most people think what you're saying. I just whenever I hear that kind of historical causality, I'm just like, I don't know. Did the garden variety German feel like, do we feel we're both American? Do we feel like we took the blame for Afghanistan and the disaster of it? Do we feel just terrible about that? Well, maybe we should, but I don't think we do, right?
Yeah. I'd also say that the material conditions are a bit different there because, I mean, Germany was forced to pay war reparations and things like this. So I think there was, and there's financial crises in Germany, even predating the stock market crash of 29. I think it probably was a bit more impacting Germans' day-to-day lives. But I think actually, so I'm actually less concerned with the idea of like guilt and blame for World War II, and more interested in the sort of transition into the society being built by the Weimar Republic, right?
Okay.
Germany goes from an empire under the Kaiser to ostensibly a republic under a president, And this is also the set of concerns that sort of give rise to Nazism, where and that sort of fueled the left in Germany, communist parties, socialist parties that compete with far-right nationalists and Nazi parties. So those sort of
I mean, as you know, probably. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say just those sort of angsts about the nature of power within society and how it should function, I think sort of can sort of fuel these anxieties that lead to German expressionism. And maybe
I mean,
our connection is sort of as you get into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the nature of the US government starts to shift between the Great Depression, FDR starting to build the welfare state. I don't know. I'd need to think more about that, and I'm not prepared to sort of stake my reputation on that argument. But
right, but okay, so of course, I mean, it's one of the most famous books of film theory. This From Caligari to Hitler, and this is really this guy, sort of fellow traveler of the Frankfurt School, Siegfried Krakauer, very smart guy. He thinks that the film is symptomatic of the German tendency toward fascism. So he sees it as, and it's interesting why he thinks that. It's not because, which is what I would say, it's not because of the emphasis on spectacle in the film. That really it's a film that's not for Krakauer the real concern. The real concern is, and I think he really thinks the ending is important because it represents Caligari as the narration that we've been given in the film ends up being just this person is just in the mental institution under the thrall of Caligari. And so it doesn't, for Krakauer, it's not really pushing back against the authority of this dictatorial figure. And so that's for him, it's symptomatic of what the attitude in Germany is. I think that's a little wacky, actually. I mean, I think that to me, the film is pretty great in terms, I mean, you could say the same thing about Kafka. You could say, oh, I don't know, the castle, it doesn't ever question the authority. I mean, that's crazy. Castle's one of the great anti-castle novels ever written. And just in the same way, I think Caligari is a critique. And the fact that it comes through this mental patient, to me, is, I don't see anything problematic about that. I mean, think about the way other later films put their critique in the guise of someone who's off or whatever, like Fight Club, the guy's schizophrenic, and he's still, it's not like, no one would say like, oh, I don't know, the critique in Fight Club of capitalism, it's just shown in the guy's schizophrenic, so it doesn't really mean it. No, I mean, it's just, that's the vehicle for articulating the critique, because if you don't fit into the social order, you're able to see more of to see things from a critical angle, I think. So but I think that's along the lines of Krakauer's take is very a historical take about how the film fits in its historical moment, both Weimar and then development of Nazism.
Yeah, I don't see this as a sort of proto-Nazi film or pro-Nazi film by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I don't think most people do today.
Yeah. I mean, but it's interesting that you raise that, because one of the things that I was thinking, and I think as sort of post-World War II subjects, I think it's increasingly, I think it's difficult often to sort of look at mid-century German works and not on some level try and see Nazism there. And one of the things that I was thinking as I was watching this is Caligari somehow meant to be Jewish? I don't think he is, but I think I think in 1920 that question would not have been a thing that would have sort of immediately jumped to anyone's mind.
Well, why
But
not?
after World War, well, because I think after World War II, where the Jew becomes a dominant figure in German culture and the German worldview, I think it makes more sense as a critic to say, is the Jew present earlier? Do we see
Right.
that earlier? Whereas prior to the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism becoming one of the driving forces of the German public consciousness, I think it's not necessarily as sort of obvious. Like there are definitely anti-Semitic German works from before World War II, as there are from throughout Europe. But again, I think it has to do more with my subject position as a viewer post World War II. And if it were 1920 and I were watching the film, I wouldn't necessarily say anti-Semitism is the defining feature of mid 20th century Germany. So I need to be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, but Mein Kampf is 23 first edition, right? So and that really is about a Jewish plot. So
yeah.
I think I think it would have been reasonable to read the film that way, except what can you tell me what, like, it seems to me like he's I don't know. What are the Jewish, what lines him with Jewish?
No, so I actually, I guess so I wasn't clear. Like that was a thing that I was thinking as I was.
No, I know, but and you're rejecting it. I understand that. But my question is, what are there any characteristics that make him align, that would lead us to align him with Jewishness?
So, I mean, the only thing that I would say that maybe, and this was, I guess this was really the reason that I started asking myself the question at all, is he's a kind of disheveled, somewhat dirty figure. And of course, in Nazi iconography, that's very common for Jews. He is a sort of transient. It seems like he's not from this town. People don't know him there.
Oh, right. But that's good.
I think those two things in themselves are too much of a stretch to sort of say, yeah, this is supposed to be a Jewish figure. And then
Francis would be this anti-Semite fantasizing about Jewish control, right?
Yeah. So I don't think it's an impossible argument, but to me, there's not enough in the film itself.
Right, I agree.
This is right.
I think that's right. I mean, it's more that he's this opposite figure, right? Like he's Caligari's this. But that's, I mean, the fact that it's open, I think, is significant as well, right? That figure controlling. I mean, it's really interesting that Hitler comes to power arguing that there's Jews behind the scenes controlling things. And then he wants to go behind the scenes and control. And that's the critique of, that's the filmic critique of Nazism. It's that it's behind the scenes indoctrinating us. So I do think that it's one of these things where the form, it can accommodate both contents, right? Like it's not exclusive. It could either be anti-Semitic or it could be radical, right? I don't think there's any. I mean, the only problem, I think that this is the problem with a film, is that it's a paranoid film, right? Like it's just paranoid, right? Like it assumes there's someone behind the scenes manipulating me and manipulating our view, and I think that's probably a problem with a lot of things that have this insight into how ideology works, that they have this paranoid structure. I mean, science fiction does this all the time. You know, Matrix is a great example. Like Matrix, on the one hand, is this great analysis of how ideology works, but then it's also tied to fundamental paranoia about we're being manipulated. So,
yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that sort of builds that visual language of power, paranoia, and ideology is actually the way that public figures, public authorities are presented in the film, right? Because I was really
they're killed.
Well, they're killed, but like,
yeah,
if you look at like the stools that public officials, the town clerk, and the police sit on. Again, this was one of those things where I was thinking about this from an actor's perspective. These are really super tall stools, so they are above the people who are standing and looking down on them. That's got to be an incredibly uncomfortable stool to be put on. But like, so you've got that sort of visual element of figures in authority literally placed above the people that they're interacting. But then there's also the fact that they don't do much of anything, right?
I think that's really important. Yeah.
I mean, the town clerk, when Caligari comes to apply for his permit to be in this fair, the town clerk tells him to wait twice and then just leaves for someone else to deal with him.
Yeah.
Francis goes to the police a number of times and is like, hey, I've got these suspicions. Here's my evidence. And they're just like, great. And they do nothing. They literally just stand there and they're like, yeah, that sounds fine.
All right.
So,
yeah, I think it's really important that the town clerk is killed and ineffectual before that, and the police are ineffectual, that there's no, although the police are right about the guy who has committed the murder, even though he's an obvious suspect because he's caught right with the person, or an attempted murder at the end. But I do think it's important that and this is this will be picked up in film noir, that the actual authority figures are feckless, right? Like there's the real authority is always behind the scenes. Actual authority doesn't have any real power, and then that feeds the paranoid view that that what's controlling us isn't the police or the governmental authority, but instead this force behind things that's able to manipulate us.
I wonder if there's almost something sort of pro-democratic about that, and I'll tell you why. Because you brought up the murderer, the attempted murderer who gets caught, right? He gets caught by other citizens. There's just a random group of mostly old men who just sort of come on and are like, hey man, we're taking you to the police. The police don't actually. Yeah, they put him in a cell, but they put him in a cell after he's brought in by citizens. The police don't investigate Cesare, really. Cesare's uncle or Jane, the girlfriend, her father, somebody goes and like questions Caligari and looks at Cesare in the thing. Francis stands outside Caligari's little hut all night to sort of keep an eye on him. It's really the citizens of this town who are doing every successful thing.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
Again, I think in the context of the sort of emerging Weimar Republic, that's maybe an interesting thing. And that's part of the reason that I'm skeptical of linking this film to Nazism, is because I think...
Yeah, but I actually think that what you just described is perfectly compatible with Nazism. I mean, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, right? Like they're led by Ernst Röhm. They're just citizens out doing, or the Klan. It's just citizens, not the cops, right? Like I think that's one of these things that can go either way, right? Like it can be. Yeah, that can be a democratic, emancipatory thing, but it also can be a fascistic thing, I think.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I would rather it's a pro-democratic film than a pro-fascist film.
There you go.
Yeah. So I think really the other thing that I'm kind of interested in us covering in discussing this film is its ongoing impact, right? Because this is again one of the sort of two films that people point to as a best example of German Expressionism. We talked a little bit about the impact on like Tim Burton and people like this, but like why in 2023, I guess, does the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari still matter?
Well, I think I think what people like about it is it's a exploration of obedience, right? And because Caligari is able to induce obedience from this figure Cesare, he's able to control him and lead him to kill people. And I think that there's a certain mystery about obedience. And I think that's a very lasting question. And it also, I think, though, is the thing we talked about before, that this distortion of the unconscious, this distortion of subjectivity, it seems like to me it's one of the best films about that. I think it is one of the silent films that really, it's not great to watch today, but it's pretty good. I think relative to other early films, I think it does have a certain lasting interest. And I think it's because it's precisely this probing of what the nature of subjectivity is, and how our look is itself always distorted by authority, right? Like, and it's not an authority that's visible, like we talked about. It's not the police or the governmental authority, but it's this authority that's behind the scenes. And I think that's really, I think it's a real hard thing to work through, because on the one hand, if you think there's an authority behind the scenes, you're susceptible to be paranoid about things. But on the other hand, if you don't think there's an authority behind the scenes, then you're just going to be the dupe of ideology. So I think it's a hard line to walk. And I think the film does a pretty good job of trying to walk that, which is, I think for me, that's why it has this lasting import.
I think that's a great assessment of why this film still matters. And of course, the sort of questions about paranoia and conspiracy theories do have a particular relevance today in the 2020s.
Absolutely.
I mean, from maybe comparatively more benign things like flat Earth and ancient aliens, up through the theories about the 2020 election and Pizzagate and things like this.
Yeah, I mean,
how we make sense of the world.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed your insights as always. And again, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciated it.